Early 1942, Japanese rapid conquests across the Pacific and the first months of the Pacific War. As the world watched in stunned disbelief, the Imperial Japanese Navy swept across vast stretches of ocean with a speed and precision that seemed almost supernatural, its carriers slicing through the waves like blades while their aircraft carved fiery scars across the skies, and every admiral, every planner, every sailor in the Allied navies felt the same cold realization settle deep in their bones. That Japan had mastered something the world had never before seen. Long-range carrier warfare executed with the discipline of a samurai strike and the technology of a modern industrial empire at its peak. And nowhere was this more evident than on the morning of December 7, 1941, when the decks of the Japanese carriers Akagi, Koga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokoku, and Zuikaku buzzed with coordinated movement as pilots climbed into cockpits, armorers loaded torpedoes, and flight deck crews signaled with practiced precision under a sky just beginning to brighten, unaware that within hours the world would be plunged into chaos. When the first wave lifted from the carrier decks and banked toward Pearl Harbor, it wasn't just a military operation. It was Japan announcing to the world that the age of battleships was already dead, even if the world hadn't realized it yet. And when the bombs began falling on the Pacific Fleet anchored in Hawaii, when battleships keeled over, when columns of black smoke twisted upward into the morning sky, Japan believed it had secured mastery of the Pacific for a generation. The early campaigns seemed to prove it. British battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse sunk in a matter of minutes off Malaya, the Philippines overrun with unstoppable momentum, Guam captured with barely a struggle, the Dutch East Indies consumed by a series of coordinated naval and air assaults, and the once mighty fortress of Singapore, thought impregnable, forced to its knees under relentless Japanese pressure. Japanese pilots, veterans of years of brutal fighting in China, soared with confidence unmatched by any opponent, while their Zero fighters, sleek and agile, dominated the skies in duels that left Allied pilots shaken and commanders scrambling for answers. In Tokyo, the Naval High Command celebrated each victory with growing conviction that their new empire could not be challenged, that their pilots and ships were unmatched, that fate itself had blessed the rising sun with dominance. But across the ocean, in America, a nation reeling from shock, anger, and humiliation, something was stirring, something quieter than the roar of Japanese triumph but far more dangerous, something that did not rely on battlefield miracles or elite pilots or early advantages. Instead, it relied on factories, blueprints, engineers, logistics officers, assembly lines, and the relentless momentum of an industrial giant slowly awakening to the reality of total war. While the Japanese Navy celebrated each new conquest, America began reshaping its fleets with a focus that Japan could not yet understand, expanding shipyards, training thousands of new pilots, and most importantly, embracing the aircraft carrier not as a temporary weapon but as the future of naval strategy, floating airfields capable of projecting power across thousands of miles. In offices lit by dim lamps, American naval architects worked through the night, designing carriers that were larger, faster, easier to repair, easier to mass-produce, and far more resilient to battle damage than anything Japan had ever considered. At training bases scattered across the United States, young men who had never seen the ocean climbed into aircraft and learned not only to fly but to operate as a coordinated machine, mastering dive bombing, torpedo attacks, deck landings, night operations, and the complex choreography of carrier warfare at a speed no nation had ever attempted. Every week brought a new carrier laid down, a new air group formed, a new squadron trained, a new logistical network expanded across the Pacific, and slowly, quietly, methodically, the United States began constructing something Japan had no counter for, a naval machine of such scale, precision, and industrial power that once it reached full momentum, it would be able to replace losses faster than Japan could record them. In Japan, admirals argued over the future of naval warfare, some insisting that battleships still held symbolic and strategic supremacy, others urging the construction of more carriers. But time, resources, and industrial capacity all worked against them, and while Japanese carriers launched brilliant early offensives, they were fragile, irreplaceable, and dangerously dependent on elite pilots who could not be replaced once lost. And as Japan extended deeper into the Pacific, occupying island after island in a vast arc of ambition, stretching supply lines thinner than they could sustain, America watched, learned, calculated, and prepared. The Pacific, once dominated by the swift and deadly movements of Japan's carrier strike groups, was slowly but inevitably becoming a battlefield shaped by a new and rising force, one that Japan, for all its early brilliance, was not prepared to face. The unstoppable tide of American carrier power that would soon begin rolling eastward, gathering strength with every hull launched, every air group trained, every logistic chain extended, until the day would come when Japan would look across the ocean it once controlled and realize that control was slipping away, not through a single battle, but through a revolution they had helped unleash yet could no longer contain. As Japan's empire reached its widest borders, stretching from the jungles of Burma to the beaches of New Guinea and from the Aleutian fog to the deep blue waters of the Solomon Islands, its admirals felt a surge of triumph that seemed to confirm every belief they had held about their destiny. Yet beneath this triumphant surface, cracks, silent, invisible, but deadly, were already beginning to spread, because while Japanese fleets maneuvered with dazzling speed, striking isolated garrisons and outmaneuvering disorganized Allied patrols, the strategic truth was that every mile gained brought Japan closer to the breaking point of its logistics, its fuel reserves, and its ability to replace the ships and pilots it was losing faster than it realized. At first, none of this mattered. The Japanese Navy had mastered the art of the opening blow, and each new conquest poured a fresh wave of confidence through the officer corps, but as the months passed, the sheer size of the Pacific began to reveal its merciless nature. Japanese carriers that once traveled freely now had to defend enormous sea lanes extending thousands of miles across hostile waters where American submarines, silent steel hunters, began picking off tankers, transports, and even fleet vessels with growing efficiency. For each Japanese carrier, there were only a handful of docks capable of repairing damage. For each aircraft lost, there were only a few dozen pilots capable of replacing the ones who died. And for each success celebrated in Tokyo, there were hours of tense conversations among Japanese logisticians warning that their forces were becoming overextended, their supply lines dangerously thin, and their shipyards incapable of supporting a prolonged war of attrition. Yet the Imperial Navy remained trapped in its belief that superior tactics and elite training could compensate for industrial weakness, while across the ocean, the United States embraced a philosophy Japan could not match: war as a contest of supply, of logistics, of output. In the cavernous steel foundries of the American Midwest, sparks flew like orange meteors from welding torches as thousands of workers, men, women, immigrants, farmers, machinists, manned assembly lines producing aircraft engines, fuselage frames, carrier elevators, torpedoes, fuel tanks, and radar systems in quantities that staggered even the most optimistic planners. The U.S. Navy had adopted a simple but devastating formula. If a ship was sunk, build 3 more. If a squadron was lost, train 2 replacements. If the enemy relied on elite pilots, create thousands of trained aviators who fought not as individuals but as a perfectly coordinated machine. This philosophy manifested in a new generation of carriers, each larger and more advanced than the ones before. The Essex-class giants whose armored decks, advanced radar suites, reinforced hulls, and efficient repair systems transformed naval warfare. While Japan struggled to produce a single new fleet carrier in the time it took America to launch multiple, American shipyards grew faster, louder, more efficient. Cranes swung colossal steel plates into place, riveting guns clattered day and night, and shipyard whistles screamed as yet another hull slid into the water, destined to join a fleet that seemed to grow with every sunrise. And as these carriers entered the war, they brought with them air groups trained not only in combat flying but in the complexities of deck management, coordinated strike packages, radar-guided interceptions, and the rapid launch-recover-launch cycle that turned each American carrier into a floating storm of relentless sorties. On the other side of the Pacific, Japanese pilots, heroes of the early war, began to notice a new kind of enemy in the sky. Disciplined, patient, methodical, operating with radar guidance and working in tight formations that were difficult to break. At first, Japan attributed these changes to Allied desperation, but soon it became clear that the enemy was evolving at a pace Japan could not match. What Japan had achieved through decades of selective training and elite specialization, America reproduced through mass organization and relentless refinement. The great Japanese strategists, Yamamoto, Nagumo, Kondo, understood what was happening but were powerless to stop it, for their nation lacked the industrial base to fight this kind of war. Oil was running low, pilots were irreplaceable, and shipyards already strained by constant repairs were overwhelmed by the need for new construction. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy expanded and experimented, introducing innovations Japan had dismissed as impossible. Night carrier operations, radar-directed fighter control, air groups designed to fight in coordinated task forces, and massive replenishment fleets capable of refueling entire carrier groups in open water, giving American fleets a mobility Japan could not comprehend. As Japanese war planners pored over maps, attempting to predict the next American strike, they realized too late that they were facing not merely a navy but an entire industrial civilization that had turned its full power toward a single goal, reclaiming the Pacific. And while Japanese sailors sailed from base to base praying for reinforcements that would never come, American ships crossed the ocean with fresh aircraft, new pilots, full tanks, and carriers built just months earlier. Japan, once the master of the carrier revolution, now found itself outpaced by a nation that had taken its own weapon and perfected it beyond anything Japan had imagined, and as the clouds of the coming battles gathered over the Pacific, the Imperial Navy was forced to confront a terrifying reality. The enemies approaching them were not simply soldiers. They were the mass-produced instruments of a war machine Japan no longer had the power to rival. As spring turned to summer in 1942, the Pacific, once a vast blue expanse dominated by the sweeping arcs of Japanese carrier groups, began to shift, subtly at first, then unmistakably, as American carriers that had once been scattered, cautious, and reeling from early defeats suddenly moved with purpose, confidence, and a newfound willingness to strike back, beginning with the daring raids on La Salamaua and the Marshall Islands, where pilots who had never before seen combat skimmed over enemy airfields and naval bases, testing their nerves and their aircraft while Japanese commanders watched with growing unease. For these attacks were not large enough to damage Japan's war machine, but they revealed something far more alarming. The United States was learning, adapting, and preparing for something bigger. In Tokyo, reports of these raids were first dismissed as nuisance strikes, the work of desperate enemies trying to maintain morale, but to the officers who studied the patterns of American movements, it was clear that the U.S. Navy had begun to master the logistical art of long-range carrier warfare, coordinating refueling operations at sea, executing complex multi-carrier strike patterns, and integrating reconnaissance, fighter cover, and dive bomber tactics in ways that mirrored, and in some places surpassed, the Japanese methods perfected during the attack on Pearl Harbor. Slowly, the Imperial Japanese Navy began to feel an unfamiliar sensation creeping into its operational planning: uncertainty. This uncertainty became panic on the morning of May 4, 1942, when the Battle of the Coral Sea erupted, an engagement unlike any naval battle in history because the two sides never saw each other directly, never fired a single battleship shell, and instead fought entirely through aircraft launched from floating airfields hundreds of miles apart. Japanese pilots, confident and aggressive, struck first, damaging the American carrier Lexington and setting her on a path that would end in a fiery, heartbreaking explosion that lit the horizon for miles. Yet even as Lexington died, the Japanese fleet carrier Shokaku limped away from the battle with a smashed flight deck, and Zuikaku, though untouched, was left with half her air group dead or exhausted. Forcing both carriers out of the coming operation Japan believed would decide the war: the attack on Midway. And this was the first moment when Japan's early brilliance turned into strategic disaster, because while Japan had spent months planning a decisive trap for the American fleet, believing that their carriers would annihilate the remaining U.S. naval power and secure the Pacific forever, American crypt analysts at Pearl Harbor had already cracked the Japanese naval codes, unraveling the entire plan like a loose thread in a tightly woven uniform. What Japan believed was a masterpiece of deception became, instead, the greatest strategic miscalculation in its naval history. As Japanese carrier strike groups approached Midway, confident they were luring American carriers into an ambush, the truth was that the Americans were already waiting, with carriers positioned perfectly, aircraft warmed and ready, and commanders fully aware of Japan's intended moves. And when the battle began on June 4, 1942, the skies above the Pacific erupted in a storm of planes, smoke, fire, and chaos that forever shifted the balance of naval power. Japan launched the first strikes, pounding Midway's airfields in an aggressive opening attack, but as their aircraft returned and the flight decks filled with refueling and rearming procedures, American dive bombers, arriving at the precise moment fate and code-breaking had aligned, plunged through the skies like falling stars, their bombs smashing into the flight decks of Akagi, Koga, and Soryu, turning the Japanese carrier force into a fiery graveyard within minutes. Japan's naval air power, once the pride of the empire, once the symbol of early dominance, was now broken in a single afternoon by a combination of intelligence, timing, and American pilots who refused to give up even as their formations were torn apart by Zeros and flak. Hiryu fought back with heroic ferocity, launching counterstrikes that mortally wounded the USS Yorktown, but she could not stand alone, and when the final wave of American dive bombers found her, Hiryu too disappeared beneath the waves, leaving the Imperial Japanese Navy without its veteran air groups, without its experienced deck crews, and without the ability to replace what had been lost. Midway was more than a defeat. It was the moment Japan's naval strategy broke, the moment their early victories turned into a long, unavoidable retreat, because while Japan had lost 4 irreplaceable carriers, America was already building new ones, training new pilots, and expanding its naval infrastructure with a speed Japan's economy could not even imagine. In Tokyo, the news of Midway spread quietly, concealed from the public but understood by every admiral and staff officer as a catastrophe from which recovery was uncertain, if not impossible. And while Japan adjusted its strategies, shifted its fleets, and attempted to rebuild, America's industrial revolution at sea was now fully awakened, and the carriers that would soon steam toward the Solomon Islands, the Gilberts, the Marshalls, and beyond were larger, stronger, and more efficiently organized than any fleet Japan could field. The Pacific, once a stage for Japan's swift and decisive victories, was now changing into a vast arena where logistics, production, and strategic depth would determine the future, and Japan, for all its early brilliance, was beginning to realize that the tide was turning against them, faster than they could ever hope to reverse. Before we continue, please let me know, did anyone in your family fight in or live through World War II? Share their stories in the comments. Let's continue the story. In the months following Midway, as the shattered remnants of Japan's elite air groups limped back to home waters and the Imperial Navy struggled to reorganize its surviving forces, the Pacific Ocean itself seemed to shift under the weight of a new and unfamiliar reality. The United States was no longer reacting to Japan. It was advancing, learning, and evolving at a speed Japan's command structure could not comprehend, and nowhere was this transformation more dramatic than in the campaign for Guadalcanal, where the newly confident American carriers, no longer tentative or fearful, began operating with the support of the expanding industrial pipeline behind them, launching operations that blended raw courage with growing logistical precision. Guadalcanal was not supposed to matter to Japan. It was a remote, barely mapped island whose name meant nothing in Tokyo before 1942, but when U.S. Marines stormed its beaches and seized the unfinished Japanese airfield, later named Henderson Field, it forced Japan into a grinding, exhausting battle that revealed the structural cracks in its entire war machine. Japanese pilots who once trained for years now arrived after mere months, barely prepared for complex carrier operations, while American pilots who survived battle after battle were steadily becoming hardened veterans, their skills sharpening the longer they fought. On the sea, the waters around Guadalcanal became known as Iron Bottom Sound, a graveyard of cruisers and destroyers lost in night battles that Japan initially dominated with their excellent torpedoes and night optics. But even here, a shift began as radar-equipped American ships learned to read the night in ways Japan could not counter. Still, it was the carriers that revealed the deepest contrast between the two powers. Japan's dwindling supply of veteran pilots was being thrown into battle again and again, and each loss became a blow from which Japan could not recover, while America's pilot training programs expanded so rapidly that by late 1942, the U.S. Navy was producing more pilots every few weeks than Japan could produce in several months. American carriers, repaired quickly, rotated seamlessly through the Pacific, supported by fleets of oilers, repair ships, floating dry docks, and a logistical network Japan had never attempted to build. Meanwhile, Japanese carriers remained vulnerable, their air groups fragile, their losses permanent, and their fuel supply increasingly limited as American submarines choked the vital shipping lanes linking Japan to the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. This growing imbalance was laid bare during the Battle of the Eastern Solomons and later at the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, where Japanese pilots fought fiercely and even managed to inflict serious damage on the U.S. fleet, but with every victory came a crushing cost: the loss of experienced aircrews. And while ships could be repaired or replaced, the pilots could not. Japanese commanders watched in frustration as new recruits, brave, eager, but barely trained, took to the skies only to be cut down by more experienced American aviators flying increasingly advanced aircraft, all while U.S. carriers integrated new tactics that emphasized coordinated fighter screens, radar-directed interceptions, and strike packages built around dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighter escorts working in synchronized formations. The momentum continued to shift in early 1943, when Japan attempted to reinforce Guadalcanal using the Tokyo Express, a series of high-speed night destroyer runs through narrow island channels, but even these daring operations faded as American air power from Henderson Field, and gradually from new carriers entering the theater, made it impossible for Japan to sustain pressure. By February 1943, Japan made the fateful decision to evacuate Guadalcanal, a stunning reversal that confirmed what its commanders feared most: they no longer dictated the terms of the Pacific War. The Imperial Navy, once a master of rapid, decisive operations, now found itself fighting a war of attrition for which it was neither prepared nor equipped, and every battle Japan fought from this point forward, from New Georgia to Bougainville to the Central Pacific, was shaped not by strategy but by necessity, as they attempted desperately to plug holes in a collapsing defensive line. The problem was that the United States was no longer merely responding to Japan's moves. It was executing a sweeping plan called island hopping, bypassing heavily fortified positions, seizing key islands, and building airfields that brought American bombers and carriers steadily closer to Japan's inner defensive ring. And as U.S. industrial power surged, producing carriers at a rate Japan considered impossible, the Imperial Navy began to realize that the early victories of 1941 and 1942 were not the beginning of a new empire, but the high water mark of a nation that had reached farther than its resources could sustain. Yet Japan's leaders, driven by pride and fear of humiliation, refused to retreat, ordering counterattacks and desperate operations that bled their remaining strength away. Every island Japan defended became a coffin for their remaining pilots, every carrier battle a reminder that their industrial base could not keep pace. And by the time Japan understood that the carriers were the true rulers of the Pacific, America already had more of them, bigger, faster, and backed by a logistical empire that stretched across 2 oceans. In Tokyo, the whispers began. The days of Japanese naval dominance were over, and the Pacific, once Japan's proving ground, was now slipping through their fingers like sand carried away by an unstoppable tide. As 1943 faded into 1944, Japan watched helplessly as the United States transformed its naval and industrial strength into a tidal wave of force that could no longer be slowed, let alone stopped. For while Japan clung to defensive strategies rooted in honor, sacrifice, and the belief that individual courage could overcome material disadvantage, the Americans were operating on a different scale entirely, constructing fleets of carriers so vast and so coordinated that they formed an entirely new kind of naval power, one that moved not as individual ships, but as entire floating ecosystems of fighters, bombers, repair crews, radar stations, anti-aircraft walls, and supply vessels capable of sustaining operations indefinitely in the vast emptiness of the Pacific. This evolution reached its full expression in the creation of Task Force 58, a multi-carrier strike group whose size and complexity stunned even the most seasoned American admirals, and whose appearance on the horizon signaled the beginning of the end for Japanese naval supremacy. Built around fleet carriers such as the USS Enterprise, USS Yorktown, CV-10, USS Essex, and USS Bunker Hill, Task Force 58 moved with the speed of a destroyer and the firepower of a small nation, unleashing raid after raid on the Marshall Islands, the Gilberts, and eventually the Marianas in a series of assaults that tore apart Japan's outer defensive ring. For Japan, the sight of dozens of American carriers massed together in a single formation was unimaginable. Their doctrine had never envisioned that air power at sea could be concentrated at such scale, nor did they possess the logistics to sustain such an armada, especially as fuel shortages spread like a disease through the Imperial fleet, limiting training hours, reducing patrol ranges, and choking off the operational radiuses of destroyers and cruisers that once roamed the Pacific freely. Japanese pilots, once the elite of the world, now flew outdated or hastily built aircraft against waves of American Hellcats guided by radar, whose operators could track incoming raids long before they appeared as dots on the horizon. Even when Japanese aircraft managed to reach the American carriers, they found their paths blocked by layered fighter screens, anti-aircraft guns firing proximity-fused shells, and radar-directed interception patterns that Japan could not replicate. This growing asymmetry was brutally exposed at the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, a battle Japan desperately hoped would blunt the American advance toward the Marianas, for the Marianas were not simply islands. They were stepping stones from which American B-29s could reach Tokyo itself. Japanese leadership understood the stakes perfectly. If they lost the Marianas, the war would enter a new phase, one in which Japan's cities, factories, and morale would come under direct assault. And so they gathered what remained of their carrier fleet, Shokoku, Zuikaku, Taiho, Junyo, Hyo, and others, crewed by hundreds of new pilots who had trained in mere weeks, lacking the combat instincts and experience of the veterans lost at Midway and Guadalcanal. When Japan launched its first massive airstrike against Task Force 58, the skies erupted into a slaughter that American pilots would later describe as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. For the Japanese aircraft, hampered by inexperienced pilots, poor formations, inadequate radio discipline, and inferior radar support, were intercepted long before they approached their targets, caught in a web of American fighter patrols coordinated with such precision that individual Hellcat squadrons fought with the confidence of hunters sweeping a familiar forest, while Japanese formations broke apart under the weight of fear, confusion, and the horrifying realization that they were flying into a battle they had never been trained for. More than 300 Japanese aircraft were shot down in a single day, many without ever coming close to the American fleet. The few that reached the carriers were met by dense anti-aircraft fire that shredded their wings and ignited their fuel tanks before they could release their bombs. Only a handful struck their targets, and even these achieved little, for the American carriers absorbed damage, repaired themselves, and remained in the fight, while the Japanese carriers could not recover from the loss of their air crews, leaving their decks barren, their hangars silent, their once proud flight operations reduced to futile gestures. Worse still, an American submarine lurking beneath the battle area delivered a devastating blow when USS Albacore sank the brand-new Japanese carrier Taiho, a symbol of Japan's desperate hope for rebuilding its naval air power. Soon after, Shokoku was also sunk by USS Kavala, and with their losses, Japan's ability to conduct carrier warfare collapsed entirely. Watching from the bridge of the battleship Yamato, Japanese officers witnessed plumes of smoke rising from the horizon where their carriers burned, and they understood with a clarity that pierced every illusion they had held. The Empire of Japan had just lost the Pacific. For the first time, the Imperial Navy reported to Tokyo that its air arm had been functionally annihilated, its remaining aircraft scattered, its pilots dead or traumatized, its carriers afloat but useless. Meanwhile, American carriers remained fully operational, their flight decks bustling with activity as hundreds of aircraft launched, landed, refueled, rearmed, and soared into the sky with a confidence that bordered on inevitability. The tide had not merely turned, it had thundered past Japan with unstoppable force. And as the American fleet moved toward the Marianas, preparing to invade Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, Japan faced a truth it could no longer ignore. It had lost command of the air, command of the sea, and command of the future. The carrier revolution, which Japan had once pioneered, now belonged entirely to the United States. By the time the Marianas fell and American forces secured Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, the Japanese Empire stood on the edge of an abyss so deep that even its most loyal commanders could no longer pretend that victory was achievable, for the collapse of the Marianas did not simply represent a loss of territory, it represented the shattering of Japan's strategic foundation, the breaking of a defensive shield that had once protected the home islands from long-range attack, and the terrifying realization that American B-29 bombers could now rise from newly captured airfields and cross the ocean directly to Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and every industrial heartbeat of the empire. As Japan reeled from this new reality, the Imperial Navy, once the sharpest blade in Asia, was reduced to a shadow of itself, unable to challenge the American fleet in open waters, unable to coordinate large-scale operations, and unable to even fuel IT's ships due to the near-total destruction of its merchant fleet by American submarines. In the halls of the Naval General Staff in Tokyo, officers studied reports of shipping losses with growing despair. Tankers sunk, freighters torpedoed, supply lines severed, fuel reserves running dry. Without oil, without trained pilots, without carriers capable of sustained operations, Japan found itself fighting not a war, but the slow extinguishing of an empire caught between stubborn ambition and crushing reality. And while American carriers surged forward with unstoppable momentum, Japan's few remaining carriers, Zuikaku among them, became symbols not of strength but of futility, for even when they sailed, they did so with empty hangars, staffed by crews who knew their missions were suicidal gestures designed to buy time that Japan no longer possessed. Meanwhile, the Americans moved deeper into the Central Pacific, launching Operation Forager and constructing air bases with the ruthless efficiency of an industrial superpower, transforming islands once covered in dense jungle and volcanic rock into sprawling complexes of runways, repair depots, fuel farms, and logistical hubs capable of supporting thousands of aircraft. From these airfields came waves of reconnaissance flights, fighter sweeps, and bomber raids that probed Japan's defenses, testing their range, their radar coverage, and their remaining air strength. Every reconnaissance photo revealed the same truth. Japanese airfields, once crowded with Zeros, Betty bombers, and the proud machines of an empire at war, were now sparsely populated with second-rate aircraft flown by pilots who had barely touched a flight stick before being rushed into combat. And over all of this loomed the relentless advance of the American Navy, which now wielded force on a scale that stunned even its own commanders, for never in history had a fleet of such magnitude existed. Hundreds of ships, thousands of aircraft, entire floating cities built around the carriers that were now the center of naval power. As Japan watched the Americans advance toward the Philippines, feverishly attempting to plan a counteroffensive, they found themselves confronting a brutal and inescapable truth. Every Japanese plan was based on assumptions of pilot skill, aircraft performance, and fleet coordination that no longer existed. Still, pride and desperation pushed the Imperial Navy to attempt one last decisive gamble. The Japanese High Command, believing that the loss of the Philippines would sever Japan from its vital oil supplies forever, committed the remnants of the combined fleet to the largest naval battle of the war, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. It was here, in late October 1944, that Japan tried to replicate the decisive naval tactics it had once used at Pearl Harbor and in the early conquests of the East Indies, splitting its fleet into multiple task forces, attempting to lure American carriers away from the landing beaches, and striking with what remained of its battleships, cruisers, and carriers. But there was a fatal flaw at the heart of this plan. While Japan deployed its remaining carriers as bait, hoping to draw the American fast carrier groups northward, those carriers no longer possessed operational air wings. They were empty shells, decoys sailing toward destruction. Meanwhile, American intelligence, bolstered by code-breaking and long-range reconnaissance, detected the Japanese movements and adjusted accordingly. When the battle erupted across the Cebuon Sea, Surigao Strait, and off Cape Engogno, it became clear that Japan no longer commanded the sea. It merely inhabited it, scattered, battered, and overwhelmed. American carrier aircraft swarmed over the Japanese fleet in waves so numerous that Japanese officers later described the sky as black with planes, an unending storm of dive bombers and torpedo bombers guided by radar, coordinated with precision, and directed by commanders who understood that Japan's last major fleet must be destroyed completely. Japan fought with courage. Yamato and Musashi fired their massive guns with thunderous fury, destroyer captains launched suicidal torpedo attacks, and cruiser gunners battled until their ammunition was gone, but courage could not overcome imbalance. By the end of Leyte Gulf, Japan had lost its last carriers, many of its remaining battleships, and the ability to ever again launch a coherent naval operation. American carriers, meanwhile, returned to their stations, rearmed, refueled, and prepared to advance further. And so the great truth became undeniable. Japan had lost control of the Pacific not because it lacked bravery or tactical skill, but because it had been overtaken by an enemy whose industrial might, logistical mastery, and carrier-centric vision had reshaped the nature of naval warfare itself. From this point forward, Japan's war was not a contest. It was an unraveling, and every island lost, every convoy sunk, every carrier destroyed was another step in a long, unavoidable descent toward final defeat. As the wreckage of the Japanese fleet sank beneath the waters off Leyte, and the Philippines fell inch by inch to American ground forces who advanced with a confidence fueled by unstoppable naval support, a terrifying new reality settled over Tokyo, a realization more crushing than any battlefield loss. Japan was no longer fighting to win the war. It was fighting to delay the inevitable, to hold back the advancing tide for one more day, one more week, one more month, even as the strategic map of the Pacific collapsed in on itself, transforming the once mighty Japanese empire into a shrinking cluster of islands surrounded by American steel, American planes, and American warships that seemed to multiply with every passing sunrise. Across Japan's remaining island bases, commanders could see the writing on the walls: fuel stockpiles dwindling to near zero, ammunition supplies drained by years of grinding conflict, and aircraft left grounded not because they lacked pilots, but because they lacked the fuel to even start their engines. And yet, even in their desperation, Japan attempted to resist, clinging to the belief that cunning tactics or sudden blows might alter the course of fate, leading to the introduction of the kamikaze strategy during the Philippines campaign, a tactic born not of strength or strategy but of despair, as Japan's remaining pilots, many barely trained teenagers with trembling hands, climbed into aircraft stripped of armor and loaded with explosives, their orders simple and horrifying: crash into the enemy, become a shield for the empire. The first kamikaze attacks struck American carriers off Leyte, sending fireballs erupting across their decks, shocking American sailors who had never witnessed such deliberate suicide attacks before. Yet even this desperate tactic failed to change the strategic equation. USA carrier groups absorbed the blows, fought through the flames, and repaired their decks with astonishing speed, while American pilots, now seasoned veterans, learned to intercept the kamikaze waves farther and farther from the fleet, reducing the impact of Japan's last-ditch weapon. Meanwhile, American submarines continued their silent strangulation of Japan's economy, sinking merchant ships with ruthless efficiency until entire convoys vanished without a trace, leaving factories idle, cities starving, and the Japanese military gasping for the fuel it needed to function. In the devastated shipyards of Kure, Sasebo, and Yokosuka, engineers watched helplessly as half-finished warships rusted on their blocks, knowing they would never be launched, while the few remaining operational vessels, Yamato, Nagato, and several cruisers, lacked the fuel to even leave port. And far to the south, American carrier task forces swept across the Philippine Sea, the South China Sea, and the waters off Formosa, smashing airfields, sinking convoys, and neutralizing Japan's last defensive lines in preparation for the next phase of the Pacific campaign, the invasion of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, islands whose strategic value lay in their proximity to the home islands and their ability to host air bases that would bring American bombers and fighters within striking distance of Kyoto, Osaka, and Tokyo itself. The battles for these islands became some of the bloodiest of the war, fought by American Marines and soldiers who advanced under the protective umbrella of carrier-based air power that Japan could no longer challenge. On Iwo Jima, the volcanic sands ran red as thousands fell in brutal close-quarters combat, while above them, American fighters roared through the skies unopposed, striking Japanese defensive positions with precision and fury. On Okinawa, the last major battle of the Pacific, Japan threw everything it had left: planes, ships, kamikazes, underground tunnels, and men willing to die rather than surrender. But the overwhelming weight of American naval aviation crushed these defenses one by one, leaving the Japanese command staring at a truth they had never imagined facing: the home islands stood naked before the enemy. And through it all, the American carriers moved endlessly, tirelessly, like steel predators that prowled the ocean without ever needing to rest, launching raids by day and by night, their decks illuminated under red combat lights, their crews working in a ceaseless rhythm of fueling, rearming, repairing, catapulting, and recovering aircraft with an efficiency that Japan had never been able to match. While Japan's remaining aircraft were hidden in mountain caves or dispersed across makeshift airfields, American Hellcats, Avengers, and Helldivers rose from the decks of dozens of carriers in coordinated swarms that struck with the precision of a machine guided by a single mind. And above it all, the newly introduced Essex-class carriers, massive, rugged, and built with a speed only American industry could achieve, became the backbone of this unstoppable force, replacing damaged ships, expanding offensive capacity, and ensuring that at any given moment, the United States could field more naval air power than Japan had possessed even at its peak. The legendary Yamato, the pride of Japan's battleship fleet, symbolized this tragic decline when she sailed on her final mission in 1945, Operation Tengo, a one-way suicide run toward Okinawa with only enough fuel to reach the American invasion fleet but not to return. Surrounded by American carriers whose aircraft circled like hawks preparing for the kill, Yamato never even saw an enemy ship. She was struck by waves of bombs and torpedoes until she erupted in a towering explosion that shook the sea, taking thousands of sailors with her. It was the end of Japan's battleship dream and the final confirmation of what experts had long predicted. Carriers, not battleships, were the future of naval warfare. And by the time Yamato sank beneath the waves, Japan had nothing left to challenge America's carrier supremacy, nothing left to stop the fleets that now closed in on the home islands with the certainty of fate and the unstoppable momentum of an empire whose industrial might had reshaped the Pacific War. In that moment, Japan understood, fully, painfully, irrevocably, that the Pacific was lost, the empire was broken, and the carriers they had once mastered were now the very tools of their destruction. If you already watched till this part, so please comment below your city name. Let's continue the story. As the waters south of Kyushu swallowed the last fragments of the Yamato and the once mighty Imperial Navy faded into a memory of steel ghosts drifting through the deep, Japan's leaders confronted a new and more terrifying enemy than American fleets or bombers, the unstoppable pressure of time itself, for with every passing week the American advance grew faster, stronger, and more coordinated, while Japan's ability to resist shrank into a withering shadow. Across the home islands, the once proud cities that had powered Japan's imperial ambitions now trembled under the relentless assault of American B-29 superfortresses, which roared across the skies in formations so vast that civilians described them as floating highways of steel stretching from horizon to horizon, each bomber carrying enough incendiary payload to ignite entire districts in a single pass. The strategic bombing campaign, launched from the freshly conquered Marianas, had turned Japan into a battleground of firestorms and devastation. Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe. Each city endured nights where fire rained from the heavens, turning wooden homes into blazing furnaces, sending rivers of flame flowing through narrow streets as tens of thousands fled with whatever they could carry. In these infernos, Japanese factory output, already crippled by resource shortages, collapsed entirely, as aircraft plants, shipyards, and munitions facilities burned to ash, leaving the military starved of the very weapons needed to counter the American advance. The skies over Japan, once defended by skillful Zero pilots, were now nearly empty, as pilots with only weeks of training were thrust into cockpits that lacked fuel, spare parts, and sometimes even functioning radios, ordered to intercept B-29 formations that flew too high, too fast, and too far for them to engage effectively. And beneath the burning skies, the seas around Japan had become a gauntlet of death. American submarines, now operating with near impunity, patrolled the shipping routes like silent predators, torpedoing tankers, troop transports, and supply ships until Japan's maritime lifelines were severed completely. Every convoy that attempted the journey from the East Indies or Korea risked annihilation, and by mid-1945, Japan's oil imports had dwindled to a fraction so small that entire air divisions remained grounded for lack of fuel, their aircraft lined up wing-to-wing on airfields that would soon be blasted apart by American naval aircraft in preparation for Operation Downfall, the projected invasion of the home islands. On Okinawa, the final major battle before the anticipated invasion, Japan unleashed the largest kamikaze assault of the war, hurling thousands of aircraft, piloted by boys barely older than high school students, at the American fleet, hoping to grind the invasion force into chaos through sheer sacrifice. But even as American ships burned under the impact of these human bombs, the outcome remained unchanged. For the U.S. Navy, with dozens of carriers, battleships, and destroyers, simply absorbed the losses and returned fire with a fury that shattered Japan's last lines of defense. The battle for Okinawa became a nightmarish preview of what awaited Japan if the Allies landed on Kyushu or Honshu. Caves and tunnels filled with determined soldiers, civilians drafted into labor corps, and defenders willing to fight to the last breath, all while American naval gunfire and airstrikes flattened defenses with overwhelming firepower. In Tokyo, the Supreme War Council studied the casualty projections for an invasion with growing horror, knowing that Japan could not withstand such a storm, yet still unable to accept the idea of surrender. Meanwhile, American carrier groups prowled off the Japanese coast, launching daily raids that crippled transportation networks, destroyed coastal defenses, and sank the few remaining Japanese vessels that dared leave port. Not a single Japanese carrier remained operational, not a single battleship could sortie, not a single convoy could move without risking annihilation. Carrier Task Force 38, the hammer of the American Pacific Fleet, unleashed strike after strike on airfields, naval bases, rail hubs, and industrial centers, its aircraft climbing into the sky at dawn and returning only when the sun dipped beneath the horizon. Japan, once the master of naval aviation, now watched helplessly as American carrier pilots operated at will, conducting reconnaissance, bombing, strafing, and sinking targets with near-total impunity. The loss of Saipan had placed Japan within range of strategic bombing. The loss of the Philippines had severed supply lines. The loss of Iwo Jima had given American fighters a base for escorting bombers on their bombing runs. The loss of Okinawa had provided the Allies with a foothold just 350 miles from Kyushu. Each loss was a piece of a collapsing puzzle, each defeat a step closer to the moment Japan knew would come, the day when American transports and landing craft would appear on the horizon in numbers that dwarfed even the Normandy landings. And across the Japanese countryside, civilians were drilled with bamboo spears, Molotov cocktails, and crude explosives, told they would be the last line of defense when the Americans stormed their shores. Yet even as the government pledged to fight to the last citizen, there was a growing recognition among Japan's military leaders that their nation was trapped in a war it could no longer sustain. The arsenals of the empire were empty, the factories silent, the railways shattered, the skies lost, the seas conquered. Japan's soldiers fought with bravery unmatched, but bravery was no answer to an enemy whose war machine surpassed anything the world had ever seen. By mid-1945, the truth could no longer be denied. Japan had not simply lost control of the Pacific had closed around them like an iron vice, tightening with every island captured, every ship sunk, every carrier strike that soared overhead. The only question that remained was not whether Japan would fall, but how, and how many lives would be consumed before the inevitable end finally arrived. As the summer of 1945 approached and the burned-out skeletons of once thriving Japanese cities smoldered beneath the relentless assault of American air power, a profound sense of finality settled across the empire. An understanding whispered in military barracks, muttered in cabinet rooms, and felt in the hearts of millions of civilians. The war was no longer about strategy, or victory, or even honor. It was about survival beneath a sky now ruled completely by American wings. The B-29 firebombing of Tokyo in March had erased entire districts in a single night, the fires so intense that canal waters boiled and asphalt streets melted underfoot, claiming more Japanese lives than even the later atomic bombings would. Yet even as Tokyo lay in ruins and other cities followed one by one, the American carrier groups continued their ceaseless raids, launching fighters and bombers that shredded what remained of Japan's air defenses. Factories operated in caves, schools turned into makeshift workshops, and civilians were conscripted into People's Volunteer Corps, ordered to prepare for the final battle with bamboo spears and sharpened farm tools. In the imperial palace, Emperor Hirohito walked through shattered courtyards and burned gardens with a quiet dread that his advisers could not ignore. For even he, surrounded by generals who spoke of honorable death and eternal struggle, saw plainly that Japan was bleeding out with nothing left to give. Meanwhile, in the cities and villages scattered across Honshu, Kyushu, and Shikoku, civilians lined up daily with empty containers, hoping for a trickle of rice or a scrap of fish from rations that had dwindled to starvation levels. their nights spent in bomb shelters listening to the distant hum of B-29 engines growing louder as another wave approached. Children grew up under the constant scream of air raid sirens, their drawings filled with images of planes, fire, and loss. Farmers watched their crops requisitioned for the military, leaving barely enough food to survive. Mothers sewed makeshift backpacks for their sons, preparing them for a war they could never hope to win. And through it all, the Imperial Navy, once considered the most formidable in the Pacific, was reduced to rusting hulks trapped in port, their hulls cracked, their ammunition gone, their fuel tanks dry. American fast carrier task forces prowled off Japan's coast at will, launching strikes that devastated airfields, shipyards, and supply depots with surgical precision, while American submarines tightened their stranglehold on the sea lanes, sinking any vessel that dared attempt passage. The Japanese army, stretched thin across China, Southeast Asia, Korea, and the Pacific Islands, could no longer move freely, its supply lines severed, its communications broken, its units isolated and starving. Entire divisions lived on handfuls of rice a day, eating bark, insects, and roots to stay alive, dying not in battle but in the slow agony of starvation and disease. As American forces prepared for Operation Downfall, the massive invasion of the home islands, Japan's high command drafted plans for Operation Ketsugo, a desperate strategy built on the belief that if they could inflict catastrophic casualties during the invasion, perhaps the Americans would negotiate a peace rather than demand unconditional surrender. But the very foundation of this strategy was flawed. It assumed Japan could still mount a coordinated defense, still field aircraft, still move troops, still supply ammunition, still muster fuel, and still fight a modern war. The truth was brutally simple. Japan had none of these things. The training of kamikaze pilots had become so rushed that they often crashed during takeoff. Aircraft were hidden in forests because there was no fuel to fly them. Civilians were instructed to fight tanks with homemade explosives and sharpened sticks. And as Japan prepared its last-ditch defenses, the American Navy tightened its blockade, cutting off even the faintest hope of survival. On the Japanese coast, women and children watched enormous American fleets sailing in close enough to be seen with the naked eye, ships so numerous that witnesses said they blotted out the horizon, carriers lined up in rows, battleships resting like iron mountains in the sea, and destroyers patrolling the waters with predatory patience. In Tokyo, the Supreme War Council debated endlessly, trapped between the reality of defeat and the fear of internal collapse. The army demanded a fight to the death. The navy admitted the war was lost. The diplomats begged for a negotiated peace that no longer existed. And above this chaos loomed the towering presence of American naval aviation, which had dismantled Japan's Pacific Empire piece by piece, island by island, carrier by carrier, city by city. The psychological impact of this naval dominance could not be overstated. For decades, Japan had believed itself invincible at sea, the inheritor of samurai spirit translated into steel and naval power. Now, civilians watched American planes fly overhead every hour, watched American ships drift along the horizon, watched American bombs fall with mechanical precision. Japan's last hope, that the Pacific would shield it, that its fleet would protect it, had died long before the flames of Tokyo lit the night sky. And as July turned to August, and the thunder of B-29 engines shook the cities daily, a sense of fatalism had spread across the empire, a quiet resignation that the Pacific had turned against them, that the carriers they once wielded with pride were now the engines of their destruction, and that the ocean they once dominated had become an unbroken highway for an enemy they could neither stop nor slow. By now, every soldier, every sailor, every civilian understood the truth Japan's leaders refused to speak aloud. Japan had not simply lost control of the Pacific. The Pacific had swallowed the empire whole, leaving nothing but a coastline waiting for the final blow. As August 1945 dawned and the humid summer heat settled over a Japan battered to its knees, a quiet, suffocating tension enveloped the nation, for everyone, from the highest generals to the humblest farmers, knew that the end was near, yet no one could imagine what form that end would take. Across the home islands, the once bustling ports lay silent, their harbors filled not with proud warships, but with sunken hulks protruding through still waters like the bones of a dead leviathan, reminders of a navy that had dared challenge the world's most powerful industrial force and had paid the ultimate price. American carrier fleets, now unopposed, sailed so close to Japan's shores that fishermen could see their silhouettes at dawn, their massive flight decks stretching endlessly toward the horizon as aircraft launched and landed in relentless cycles, carrying out strikes that hammered Japan's last remaining defensive positions. In the cities, where bomb shelters had once offered a semblance of protection, citizens now huddled with no illusions left, listening to the rumble of B-29s overhead and knowing the destruction they brought could wipe out entire districts before a single air raid siren could sound. Rural villages, far from the coastal targets, were not spared either, as transport systems collapsed and food shortages reached catastrophic levels. Mothers boiled weeds to feed their children, fathers scraped together handfuls of rice to last a family for a week, and entire communities faced starvation as the American blockade choked the life out of Japan's economy. Yet even in this collapse, the Japanese government clung to hopes of a negotiated peace, refusing to surrender unconditionally, hoping that the Soviet Union might intervene diplomatically, even as Soviet forces prepared their own devastating strike. And then, into this desperate landscape, came a force the world had never seen before: the atomic bomb. When Hiroshima vanished in a blinding flash on August 6, Japanese officials initially refused to believe the reports, convinced it was merely another conventional bombing raid. Only when scientists analyzed the destruction did the horrifying truth emerge. A single bomb had obliterated an entire city, leaving tens of thousands dead in an instant and tens of thousands more dying slowly from burns, shock waves, and radiation that seeped through the streets like an invisible poison. Still, elements within the Japanese military urged continued resistance, claiming even such devastation did not justify surrender. But their arguments shattered 3 days later when Nagasaki was consumed by a second atomic strike, proving beyond any doubt that America now possessed a weapon capable of wiping out every major Japanese city without ever landing a single soldier on the beaches. Yet even then, even as the empire's cities smoldered and its military lay in ruins, defeat might not have come immediately had it not been for the final blow: the Soviet Union's sudden entry into the war. On August 9, the Red Army surged into Manchuria with overwhelming force, smashing through the once proud Guangdong Army in days, overwhelming Japanese defenses that had been considered impregnable. With the Soviets advancing from the north and the Americans preparing to invade from the south, Japan found itself trapped in a tightening vice, surrounded by enemies on all sides, its people starving, its cities burning, its navy sunk, its skies lost, and its leaders staring into an abyss with no escape. Inside the imperial palace, Emperor Hirohito convened what would be the most consequential meeting of his reign as the Supreme War Council split between surrender and the futile hope of fighting on. Army officers argued for a final, decisive battle on Japanese soil, insisting that if civilians fought alongside soldiers, perhaps American morale would falter. Navy officers, their fleets gone and their pilots dead, urged surrender before Japan ceased to exist altogether. And then Hirohito, breaking centuries of imperial silence, spoke words that stunned every commander in the room: "We must endure the unendurable." The emperor had made his decision. The war must end. As surrender terms were prepared, a final tragedy unfolded when a faction of desperate officers attempted a coup, hoping to seize control of the palace and prevent the surrender broadcast from reaching the Japanese people. For one night, gunfire echoed through Tokyo as loyal guards fought to protect the emperor's recording, hiding it in a safe place until morning. When the sun rose, the coup collapsed, and the recording was broadcast to millions across Japan in the emperor's trembling voice, announcing surrender for the first time in the nation's history. On American carriers stationed off Japan's coast, sailors listened in stunned silence as messages crackled over the radio, confirming what once seemed impossible: Japan had surrendered. In the streets of Tokyo, families wept, some in relief, some in disbelief, some in grief for loved ones lost. Across the Pacific, American soldiers lowered their rifles, knowing they would not have to storm the beaches of Kyushu in a battle projected to claim millions of lives. And above everything, the Pacific Ocean, once the battlefield on which empires clashed, lay quiet at last, its waves washing gently against ships that had fought their way across thousands of miles. Japan's dream of Pacific dominance had ended not in fire but in exhaustion, starvation, and the overwhelming weight of an enemy whose carriers, submarines, and industrial might had crushed Japan's ability to wage war long before the atomic bombs fell. In the end, Japan did not lose the Pacific in a single battle. It lost it in the slow collapse of an empire pushed beyond its limits, in the shattering of a navy that could no longer rise to meet the enemy, in the destruction of a homeland ravaged from above, and in the realization, too late, that the Pacific Ocean Japan once dominated had become a pathway for an unstoppable force that would reshape the world. And so, as American carrier decks hummed with the machinery of victory and Japanese civilians watched Allied planes drop leaflets announcing food shipments instead of bombs, one truth had become undeniable. Japan had lost control of the Pacific not because it lacked courage, but because courage alone could not stand against the full power of a nation whose industrial might, technological innovation, and relentless strategy had made the Pacific Ocean an American highway, and turned the tide of history. Forever. As the dust of surrender settled and the echoes of Emperor Hirohito's broadcast faded across the devastated cities and scarred countryside of the home islands, a stunned silence fell over Japan, a silence not of peace, but of reckoning, as a nation that had once dreamed of dominating the Pacific now struggled to comprehend the scale of its collapse, a collapse driven not by a single defeat, but by a relentless chain of events in which the Pacific itself became the stage for Japan's gradual unraveling. In the weeks following the surrender, American ships, many of the same carriers, cruisers, and destroyers that had torn through Japan's defenses, now sailed peacefully into Japanese waters, their decks lined with sailors who watched in quiet awe as they approached cities that had once seemed untouchable. Tokyo Bay, which had once been guarded by coastal guns and proud warships, now welcomed the USS Missouri, the towering battleship chosen to host the formal surrender. As American landing craft ferried troops to the Japanese mainland, citizens lined the roads, bowing deeply, their faces hollowed by hunger and grief, yet relieved that the nightmare of endless bombings had finally ceased. The Pacific Fleet, once held back by Japanese conquests, now anchored calmly in sight of Mount Fuji, an unimaginable display of dominance that showed how thoroughly Japan had lost control of the waters it once sought to rule. All around the harbor, sunken Japanese ships, destroyers, carriers, submarines, rested beneath the surface, visible through the clear blue waters like tombstones marking the empire's final failure. Japanese sailors stood at attention on the few remaining piers, their uniforms faded, their spirits broken, watching as American Marines marched ashore with precision that had once shattered island after island. And yet, beneath the order and ceremony of surrender lay a deeper truth. The Pacific, which had once been a vast, seemingly endless ocean separating nations, had become the instrument of Japan's defeat because Japan had never fully understood the scale of the industrial colossus it had challenged. In 1941, Japan believed it could strike fast, seize territory, and force negotiations. But the Pacific was not a barrier to the United States. It was a highway, one that American shipyards, factories, and carriers transformed into an unbroken path of victory. By 1945, American carrier groups operated so efficiently that Japan's commanders described them as floating factories of death, capable of launching more aircraft in an hour than Japan could produce in a month. And now, in the aftermath, these same fleets delivered food, medicine, and supplies to a starving population, demonstrating not only power but an industrial capacity so vast that it had shifted effortlessly from war to relief. Meanwhile, in the rubble of Japanese cities, citizens wandered through ruins trying to reclaim pieces of their shattered lives. Women searched for family members lost during the firebombings, men salvaged scrap metal to rebuild homes, and children played among the skeletons of buildings, unaware that they were living through one of the most significant transitions in world history. American occupation forces quickly realized that Japan was a nation on the edge of famine, its railways destroyed, its food imports cut, its farmlands disrupted by mass conscription. And so, the same navy that had once strangled Japan's supply lines now opened them, delivering shipments of rice, wheat, canned goods, and medical supplies. This surreal reversal was not lost on Japanese civilians, who watched the arrival of American goods with a mixture of confusion, gratitude, and lingering fear. In government offices now supervised by Allied administrators, Japanese officials pored over reports showing exactly how their empire had collapsed. Merchant shipping reduced by 85%, aircraft production crippled by loss of aluminum, tank factories bombed into silence, and oil imports cut to nearly zero. The numbers were staggering, but behind each statistic lay a larger strategic truth. Japan had not simply been outgunned. It had been outproduced, outsupplied, outtrained, and outmaneuvered by an enemy that understood the Pacific in a way Japan never had. American strategy had been built on logistics, on the power to project force across thousands of miles of open ocean, on the belief that the Pacific could be crossed, dominated, and controlled through carriers, submarines, and industrial muscle. Japan's strategy, rooted in the successes of early surprise attacks, had assumed a shorter war, a war of rapid strikes and fast negotiations. But the United States had refused to negotiate, refused to relent, refused to be intimidated by the distances or losses, and instead had turned the Pacific into a relentless conveyor belt of ships, planes, fuel, men, and supplies. And now, as American occupation forces mapped out the reconstruction of Japan, they could see clearly the trail of destruction their fleets had carved. From Guadalcanal to the Marianas, from Leyte Gulf to Okinawa, every step of the American advance had been powered by carriers that Japan could not sink and by submarines Japan could not detect. The Pacific had become the decisive battlefield, and Japan's defeat had been sealed long before the atomic bombs fell. Sealed by the loss of sea control, by the destruction of its navy, by the annihilation of its air wings, and by the unbreakable chain of American supply lines that carried war from California to the shores of Tokyo. Japanese naval officers, brought to the USS Missouri for the signing ceremony, stared in silent grief at the assembled Allied fleet, understanding perhaps for the first time the true scope of the power they had challenged. They bowed deeply as General Douglas MacArthur presided over the surrender, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that the Pacific, once their gateway to empire, had become the graveyard of their ambitions. And so, as the documents were signed and the war officially ended, the winds sweeping across Tokyo Bay carried with them the final truth Japan had been forced to learn across years of fire and blood. They had lost control of the Pacific not simply because America had more ships, more planes, more men, but because the Pacific itself had chosen the side of the nation that could command it with industry, logistics, and unyielding determination. In the months that followed the surrender ceremony aboard the USS Missouri, as the ink dried on the documents that brought an end to the most devastating conflict the Pacific had ever witnessed, Japan began the long, painful process of understanding how an empire that once seemed unstoppable had collapsed so completely, and everywhere across the shattered landscape. From the charred remains of Tokyo to the rubble-filled streets of Osaka, from the rice paddies of Kyushu to the ruined shipyards of Kure, the same unspoken question lingered among soldiers, civilians, and leaders alike. How had Japan lost control of a region it once dominated with such confidence and ferocity? The answer lay not in a single defeat or a single battle, but in a chain of miscalculations spanning years. The belief that Japan's warrior spirit could overcome America's industrial might, the assumption that the Pacific was too vast for the United States to sustain operations across, the reliance on highly skilled pilots who could not be replaced, the overconfidence in battleships that were already obsolete, the inability to adapt to the era of carrier warfare, the failure to understand logistics, fuel, and production as weapons just as powerful as guns and torpedoes. And so, as American occupation forces patrolled the streets, distributing food and rebuilding bridges, Japan's once proud military leaders returned to their homes in disgrace, stripped of their commands, haunted by the ghosts of decisions that had led their nation to ruin. Former pilots stood on airfields where Zero fighters once took off in tight formation and saw only scavenged wreckage. Engineers walked through shipyards where the hulls of unfinished carriers lay rusting under the rain. Generals revisited bunkers carved into hillsides and found them empty, silent, useless. The Pacific, once envisioned as Japan's gateway to resource-rich colonies and strategic dominance, had become a vast expanse controlled entirely by American naval power. Where Japanese flags once flew over island chains, now American fleets patrolled with ease, their carriers casting long shadows over waters that had seen countless battles between destroyers, cruisers, submarines, and aircraft. And every Japanese citizen alive at war's end, whether veteran or child, carried within them the memory of a time when the sky burned and the seas roared with engines of destruction. Meanwhile, the American Navy, which had once fought its way across the Pacific in brutal island-hopping campaigns, now found itself anchored peacefully in the harbors of a nation it once viewed as an implacable foe, its sailors walking among people who, only months earlier, had been taught to fear them as monsters. In this surreal coexistence, Americans witnessed firsthand the suffering Japan had endured, and slowly, cautiously, bonds began to form. Children waving at Marines stationed near their neighborhoods, farmers offering what little food they had to American medics, and Japanese laborers working side by side with Navy engineers to repair bridges and docks destroyed by firebombs and naval strikes. The Pacific War had ended, but the Pacific itself remained, endless, powerful, indifferent to human ambition, and as Japan rebuilt under Allied guidance, the ocean that had once carried fleets toward conquest now carried cargo ships filled with food, machinery, and hope. Within a decade, Japan would rise again, not as a military empire, but as an economic power rebuilt upon the ashes of war, its shipyards humming with commerce instead of conflict, its factories producing goods for trade instead of weapons for domination. Yet beneath this rebirth lay the unalterable truth carved into history. Japan had lost control of the Pacific because it had underestimated the enemy it awakened, because it believed courage alone could defeat industry, because it relied on brilliance where it needed mass, because it fought with valor but without the resources to sustain a long war. The United States, by contrast, had approached the Pacific with a different philosophy, one rooted not in glory but in logistics, not in individual heroism but in coordinated power, not in assumptions of superiority but in the willingness to adapt, innovate, and produce on a scale the world had never seen. And so, in the final reflection of veterans on both sides, the war in the Pacific became more than a clash of empires. It became a lesson etched in blood across thousands of miles of ocean, a reminder that even the greatest naval traditions cannot stand against the relentless pressure of industrial might and strategic vision. As American ships finally withdrew from Japan in the late 1940s, steaming east across the same waters they had once crossed in war, their wakes shimmered beneath the rising sun, leaving behind a nation forever changed, humbled by defeat, strengthened by rebuilding, and bound to the Pacific not as a conqueror but as a survivor. And for generations to come, the story of Japan's fall, not from lack of bravery, but from the crushing force of an enemy who mastered the sea, the sky, and the very nature of modern war, would echo across the world as a stark reminder of the moment an empire learned that the Pacific was too vast, too powerful, and too unforgiving to be controlled by anything less than a superpower armed not only with ships and planes, but with destiny itself. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered, and we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.